Thank you. My name's David. One of the things that we were concerned about from the beginning is that principles of trauma-informed care sound very alien to those of us who have a footing in the church. And one of the things we were concerned might happen if we produced a poster that sounded too psychological was that people wouldn't look at it if it went up in a church porch, and that clergy wouldn't know what to do with it if it came in the post. And so we wanted to find ways to remind the church that in fact these are not alien principles. These are in fact things that the church has known ever since there's been a church. And so we reached out and worked with two priests in the diocese, Ray Caro and John Villaseca, who helped us come up with biblical quotations and who wrote theological reflections on those biblical quotations. And those are things that you'll find in the printed materials that Carol will introduce in a few moments. That was very important to us, partly because we recognize that for many people, and because of the things that Sarah's just talked about, the sense of shame, the sense of unworthiness, many people who have experienced abuse in the church are no longer able to be in the church. That could mean never setting foot in a church again. That could mean setting foot in a church physically, but then dealing with everything that happens inside when you're in the building. When the building itself triggers the trauma, when the music, the liturgy, all sorts of things about the building create stress for the individual who's experienced the abuse. So we were thinking about ways in which to encourage church communities to adopt a more compassionate and also confident approach to responding well to those who have the courage to speak, but also creating environments in which it's more likely that those people would take that very difficult step of speaking about their experiences. One of the things that I thought about a lot before we had our contact with Ray and John was the very last one. Would you value who I am right now? I struggle constantly with the Bible, but I struggled to find a passage that would speak to me in ways that would help. And I'll say a little bit about this passage about the sparrows in a few moments. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about my story. I grew up in an Anglican family in Canada in the 1980s. When I was 8 years old, I joined a choir that was directed by the organist in my parish, and I learned to sing, and I loved it. When I was 11 years old, the choir master began sexually abusing me. I was the victim of repeated sexual assaults by him. And when I told, two things happened very quickly. The first thing was that the police got involved. There was a criminal investigation, there was a trial, there was a conviction, there was a custodial sentence. So there was justice. What happened in church was very different. The Sunday after the organist was arrested and there was no music, what happened that Sunday was that the clergy, our vicar, the church wardens, other people in the parish sided with the organist against our family. They made us unwelcome in the parish. The priest phoned our home repeatedly, urging us to forgive, by which he meant stop cooperating with the police. I now see this as a form of spiritual abuse. I couldn't see that as a child. But the damage that did to me, and the fact that we felt so unwelcome in that parish that we had to leave, left a permanent, well, I shouldn't say permanent, a very long-lasting scar in my relationship with the church and my relationship with other Christians, my relationships with clergy, my relationship with God. One of the things that the police investigation uncovered was that the organist had previously worked at a cathedral in a nearby diocese, and that a similar complaint had been made to the cathedral clergy when he worked there, and that they had decided to cover it up and get him to leave quietly. So I had to come to terms with the fact that I was abused because of the church's failure to respond properly to a disclosure of abuse. It would not have happened to me if the church had responded well in the 1970s. We moved from that parish to a new parish not too far away. In that second parish, I again became a victim of sexual abuse. As with Sarah's story, one of the major risk factors for becoming a victim of sexual abuse is previous abuse of one kind or another. And so this pattern is a common point between our two stories. What I concluded from this, especially, maybe it won't surprise you to know, I didn't tell anybody about the second abuse. Because what had I learned from the first time? What I learned was, if I speak up, the church will turn on me. The church will disown me. And so, of course, I didn't say anything. But I concluded that there must be something wrong with me, that I must be somehow problematic. There was no point in speaking out. It was not safe to speak out. In short, I concluded that I was inherently worthless. Now, life goes on, and you work with what you've got. And I found a way to be in the church, even to be involved in the church while carrying all of this. But at some point, for many people, it comes back. It came back for me decades later, nearly 40 years later, when I happened to be a bystander witness in another sphere of life where I saw somebody treated in a very similar way to the way I had been treated. And it was a huge trigger. And suddenly I could not cope. Suddenly the effort necessary to hold all those things in was insufficient. I don't know whether exploded or imploded is the right way to describe it, but my doctor signed me off work for PTSD. That was just over 2 years ago. I've had a lot of therapy. I'm still in therapy, but if you told me 2 years ago that I'd be standing here now telling you this, I don't think I could have believed it, because I was in a pretty bad way. One of the first things that happened after I got into therapy and started to feel a bit of strength was I started thinking about what had happened to me in that choir all those years ago and wanting to understand it as an adult, because all my memories were those of a child. And I wanted to know, how did that guy get from that cathedral to my parish? Who made those decisions? Who put him on that route? I just wanted to know their names. I didn't want to sue them. Some people would. I just wanted to know. And so I looked him up. And I tried to find the information about what had happened in the 1970s. But I couldn't find anything. There was no internet. There was no Google then. But I found something else instead. He was the organist at a church in the United States. He was again working in the same context in which I had been abused. I needed to say something to someone, but I still felt the fear, the terror of that man. That's how I managed to, through a good response from clergy that I knew, I got a contact with Carol and the safeguarding team here, who very quickly made contact with the safeguarding team in the place where the perpetrator of that abuse was now working, and they dealt with it, and he was no longer working there a few days later. But this shows that poor responses in the past are connected to current risks in the present and the future. It also shows that dealing with historic abuse, which is only historic to those who are not experiencing it, to those with PTSD, it's now, all the time, but non-recent abuse, shall we say. Dealing well with non-recent abuse means actually making the whole church safer, as Sarah has said, because those who are at current risk can be protected. When I came to working with Carol and Sarah on the strategy, I was thinking a lot about music. I was thinking about mending, as much as I could, my relationship with the church through church music, which I'd done throughout, but had become very difficult for me recently. So I decided to write a piece of music. Again, words can be difficult, and sometimes other forms can help us get more closely in touch with what it is we want to say. What Sarah's angels do for me is show me visually, if the church responded well, what might that look like? And I asked myself, what might that sound like? And it took me back to a memory of that horrible time when I was 11. There was a place that I used to go to feel safe when nothing felt safe. It was a wood. And in the high, tall maple trees, you couldn't see them, but there was a species of sparrow. This passage from Matthew is about how much God values us and how our value is much greater than the sparrows that are sold for so little. So I thought about those sparrows and their beautiful voices. Maybe we could have here's the passage that I'm referring to. Do not be afraid, you are of more value than many sparrows. Maybe we could have a picture of the sparrows. This is the white-throated sparrow. Unfortunately, you don't have it here in England. We don't have it here in England. But Peter's going to play the sound. That's its ascending song, and then it has a descending song as well. And I was thinking about the fact that, as I said earlier, none of this material in our strategy is new to the church. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to try to create a piece of music that is entirely unoriginal? What if I used only the songs of these sparrows and music that the church already knows to create a kind of meeting point between the two? Before we play the music, we're going to show you two videos. The first is going to be a video of a choir that was standing right here, actually, just a couple of weeks ago, performing the piece that I wrote. And then we're going to show you a video of Sarah's angels back to back. But maybe we could have the next slide. I'll show you what I did with this. I thought, what if I score this for two choirs and an organ? The organ's really just the trees that hold the sparrows up. And the sparrows sing, but they are met outside by the church with one of its old songs. Before we play the video, I'm just going to read the note that I printed on the inside of the score. One of the most devastating effects of sexual abuse is that it is so often characterized by betrayal. For those who have experienced it in a church context, the betrayal is compounded with hypocrisy. What has been done to them in secret is so completely at odds with what others see that victims become silenced by fear and shame. Many carry the secret burden of a guilt that is not theirs for years or decades. The church has not always responded well, institutionally or individually, to those who find the courage to speak about what happened to them. Their stories have sometimes been disbelieved, their experiences minimized, their complicity assumed or insinuated, their needs given less consideration than the status of those responsible for the abuse. For some, this second betrayal is at least as devastating as the first. What links the two experiences is that in combination they often reinforce the sense of worthlessness from which many survivors suffer. The Gospels suggest a very different response. In Matthew 10 and Luke 11 and 12, Jesus addresses the evils of betrayal and hypocrisy directly. Both passages record his insistence that all wrongdoing will be exposed, his encouragement not to fear those who can harm the body but not the soul, and his analogy of the sparrows, which, though they are sold for so very little, are not beyond God's care. So do not fear, he concludes. You are worth more than many sparrows. What if the Church honored these words? What would it be like for survivors of abuse if they were met by a church whose responses were in keeping with this statement? What transformations might then be possible? What might the Church recognize in survivors' stories if it could see them through the lens that Jesus holds up in this verse? This piece is a musical attempt to envisage such an encounter. It is based on two songs of the white-throated sparrow and on one verse, next slide please. Next slide. And on one verse of J.M. Neale's translation of the hymn Aeterna Christi Munera, attributed to St. Ambrose, the 4th century bishop of Milan. It might be best not to think of it as a piece of music at all. Imagine instead a forest, an unbuilt space, a place where those who have been exiled by fear and shame can be met with humility and respect, where their voices are not silenced, and where their songs remind us of other songs we have long known. I wrote this as a victim of sexual abuse in a church context and of hostile responses by the church when the abuse was disclosed. The piece is dedicated to all who have suffered similar things and to those who love and support them.